elections are not just what happens when somebody is voting. It's not just what happens on election day. It's also the entire cycle of activities that go into an election.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Holly Ann Garnett, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario. Holly's research examines how electoral integrity can be strengthened throughout the electoral cycle, focusing on the institutions that run elections and manage them, as well as election technology and campaign finance. Now, in our conversation, we cover quite a bit of ground. We talk about how her work at RMC has influenced her thinking about politics. We talk about how elections are not just what happens on the day that someone votes, but are much, much broader than that. We ask if trust in our democracy is eroding. And we talk about campaign finance, polarization, politics as a game, the unique Canadian challenges of democracy, and another key word, which is resiliency. Finally, in the end, we ask a very interesting question. Is there still a democratic consensus, or maybe more specifically, a liberal democratic consensus? I think this is a question that, at least on the surface in the big conversation, we are addressing, and we're wondering what the answer is. Now, if you like this show, please give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. Please also go to the website where you can listen to any previous episode and give me feedback on any of them or on this one. Let me know what you think of this conversation, and let me know who you think should be on this show in the future and what we should be talking about. Holly Ann Garnett, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming to this. I'm really excited to chat with you. There's a lot of stuff that you work on and research that I want to dig into, especially in light of the 2019 Canadian federal election. We may or may not actually talk about that, but I think the things that we will talk about will come into contact with that election. Before I get to the first question, though, I wanted to ask you, we're here at the Royal Military College of Canada.
Yes.
Which is a fascinating place. I was walking towards your office where we're here doing this conversation and saw people in uniform walking, in marching down to the square all alone.
First years.
I guess they're first years, yeah. And it's just a fascinating environment. And I just wonder, for someone who's not in the military and who, your prior academic career was not at military colleges, what's it like to work here?
It's an amazing place to work. So I'll be honest, I hadn't thought of working at the Royal Military College until the job came up. It wasn't something that I ever thought they would hire somebody like me who studies elections and democracy and public opinion and those sorts of things. So so the job came up. I applied for it, and it's a really neat place to be an academic. So the students are fantastic. They're super driven. They all have to come to class. So every 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, they are in my class, ready to go. And they've already been up for a while doing other things if there's been inspections or there's been PT or whatever. So the students are incredibly driven. It's a different kind of an environment because they kind of know where they're going. They know that they have a job waiting for them at the end. And so it's a very different sort of environment. So working with the students has been fantastic. I absolutely enjoy that. And then outside of that, I have complete freedom to do whatever sort of research I'm interested in, whatever sort of things that I think are important to share with the Canadian public. And so I do research in my fields, Canadian politics, comparative politics. And I really have the freedom to do that kind of research, to apply for research grants, to speak publicly. I think my UTs, so university teachers in the Canadian government, I think because we are also public servants, I think we're the only ones who are allowed to kind of speak publicly about our areas of expertise.
You can't be muzzled as a scientist, for example.
Yeah, absolutely not. We have full academic freedom. And so it's a really great place. I have fantastic colleagues, and I enjoy being here. Yeah. Yeah,
it was really interesting because we took the stairs to get to your office. You're on the fourth floor here. And, that's cool for me. And you actually said, I don't know where the elevators are. And nobody else did because there were a ton of other people taking the stairs. And it feels like that's part of the culture here. It's obviously a culture of fitness and being ready to serve. Mm-hmm. I just found that really interesting. And I wonder if you think that makes it a better learning environment or if it's the same as anywhere else.
So it's definitely different. So the students here, especially the officer cadets, so all the undergraduate students are either in the reserves or they're officer cadets training to be officers in the Canadian Forces. So they all have to in their 4 years here, they have to do 4 pillars. So they're academics, so they're getting a degree, the military training, and then there's also athletics and the bilingualism. So every student, when they leave here, or the officer cadets at least, they leave as functionally bilingual in both English and French. So it's actually, I like to say it's, and one of my colleagues says this too, is that it's kind of one of the last real liberal arts colleges in Canada, in the sense that also the students have a core curriculum that they have to take. So when I teach Canadian politics in the winter, my sections are full of engineering students, science students. So regardless of what degree you are in, you are taking courses in history and political science, you're learning a second language, and you're taking math courses. So everybody is taking this core curriculum of courses. And that's not something that is very common at most universities. And I think the idea behind that is to be an officer, we want you to have a really, the college wants you to have quite a breadth of understanding and knowledge to kind of then send you out there to lead other people.
Well, and a shared language too, right? Like that,
exactly.
that we've all done the same courses. It's not like, okay, you're in drama and you over there are in engineering and you have nothing in common in terms of what you're learning. But we know that learning is actually a total holistic experience.
Exactly.
And that there are relationships and connections between all of these different things. And I really, it's interesting too that you mentioned that there's a goal here, right? There's a need for this education. It's not going to lead somewhere we don't know yet. No, you're trying to produce officers for the military of this country.
Absolutely.
Which is interesting because before we actually turned this on, we talked about a previous episode of this podcast about higher education.
Yes.
And one of the central themes of that conversation was, what is the purpose of education, of higher education, of high school? What is the purpose here? I mean, sure, we're helping people to get a job and careers. That's fine, but it's more than that. We're also creating a civil society in which we have a shared language, shared understanding, and a shared appreciation for what underpins our society. Here, it's much more specific. Here, it's producing officers. Do you feel that in your work that is actually what you're doing, or do you feel you get, because of the academic freedom, you're more in tune with the need for curiosity and a higher sense of learning?
So as academics, we have a unique place in that, right? So I like to say that my classes are a place where these students who, in a lot of other facets of their life, are learning how to be trained to do a specific thing, to respond to direction well, where I encourage them to try on different ideas for size, to say things that they might say later, actually, no, never mind, I've changed my mind, which is not necessarily what they're doing in other facets of their life here at the college. They're, following orders. They're learning specific procedures to do things. And so in my classes, I want to create a space where they can kind of think through things, try different ideas on for size. And that's also part of their training to be an officer, because they're going to have to think really critically in order to lead other people. So that's one key component. And I think that's why at the college there's the 4 different pillars that they learn, so that when they come out, they're quite well-rounded and ready to kind of take on whatever new challenges come at them.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating idea, that in order to create a sense of discipline and camaraderie, you actually have to get outside the box once in a while to understand what that means in a way. Holly, I want to give you the first question, the big one.
Okay.
It's really simple. What on earth is going on?
Yeah, so if you haven't heard, there's an election campaign going on. So October 21st, there will be an election. But one thing that I really want to highlight is, there's an election going on today, too, in the sense that there are people who can vote at Elections Canada returning offices at any point during the campaign. So people are voting now. But then the other cool thing is that elections are not just what happens when somebody is voting. It's not just what happens on election day. It's also the entire cycle of activities that go into an election. And you can see that especially now in, say, the social media environment, in the fact that campaigns technically start when the writ is dropped, but really they're starting well ahead of time, when voters are being registered, when election laws are being decided, when the campaign is pretty much on at all times, with this idea of permanent campaigning in Canada. And so elections are not just something that happens once every 4 years, or if you have a minority government, once every however long you can last.
Weeks, yeah.
You never know. It's a continual cycle of activities. And so that keeps me occupied, between election times, although I'll be honest that during a campaign is a good opportunity to nerd out over cool election things that get me very excited. But that's kind of what's going on is at any point in time, we are in an election at some point in some way, shape, or form.
So the issues of this campaign to the side, is there anything special about this time, 2019, an election happening in Canada, and there's an election happening next year in the United States? Is there anything peculiar about elections right now? I think that's obvious, like it's almost like a softball question. I know that the answer is yes, but what is peculiar about elections and democracy right now, especially in the work that you do?
Yeah, so this is the first campaign since the 2016 American presidential election. And that was really what woke up a lot of scholars, but then also the public, to this idea that disinformation, misinformation, cybersecurity concerns are something that is now we have to worry about for elections. I think it's not something we really paid that much attention to previously. I liken it somewhat to the 2000 election in the United States, when all of a sudden we started asking questions of election administration issues. What do our ballots look like? How are we voting? With the obviously the Bush versus Gore contest and the hanging chads in Florida and all that kind of stuff, it suddenly woke up scholars to this idea that, how we run elections really matters. And so I see the 2016 campaign in the United States as being quite similar, opening up this idea of, oh my goodness, we haven't really studied how foreign interference can influence our elections through digital means. And so what we're watching, and what I think the Canadian government has tried to set up, and obviously saying this from just as an academic, has tried to set up with the Election Modernization Act, with the SITE Task Force, tried to set up and try to test for the first time kind of some of the ways that we can be more resilient to these sorts of issues. So that's one thing that I've been paying attention to. It hasn't really thus far made much of the news. It hasn't been a headline. But we know at least now that the issues of misinformation, disinformation, cyber attacks, defacing of websites, all these sorts of different issues that could come up, we know that they're a possibility. And really we were woken up to that in the 2016 American election.
Yeah, I really want to talk about all of that, especially when it comes to the months and months leading up to an election and how it can be influenced by different factors, and how some of them may be legitimate, but some of them may be illegal even. But before we get there, I want to talk about the actual act of voting.
Okay.
The fact of going into a ballot box, for example, using
you
a
don't
pencil.
Actually go into the ballot box.
Sorry, you go, well, in Canada, what I remember is going into a cardboard screen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Canadian.
I was just joking.
And then getting a piece of paper, and like literally with a pencil marking an X on a piece of paper. Yeah. Sometimes it's simple, sometimes it's more complicated. There's a scholar that both of us know, Anthony Sayers at University of Calgary, who said to me once that it's really important that elections, that the actual physical act of voting is difficult and is on paper, because it's harder to make that fraudulent. So his argument is that if you have an electronic voting system, for example, which I know we can talk about, it's a lot easier to manipulate that. But Anthony's argument is that, well, if we just do it on paper, yes, you can still manipulate this, but it's harder.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of concomitant to his argument about federalism, that it's good that we have this messy federal system of a national government, provincial governments, and then municipal governments that fight amongst each other, because that is another layer to defend the citizenry against one thing taking over. And I just wondered what you thought about that, and if this kind of apex that we have right now of technology and this weird time in our culture coming together, is there something we should be doing to protect our voting system in the actual act of voting, or is technology an opportunity for making it easier and more broadly done? Yeah,
so it's both. I can't kind of give a clear answer one way or the other. So on the one hand, we know that that using technology in elections in some ways can help with some aspects of accessibility, especially, we've seen, for example, I've done research on online registration in Canada, and we see that young people are using it. So adopting technology into the electoral process can help attract some voters maybe that wouldn't be voting otherwise. Now, The downside, though, is that there are also negative consequences. Do people trust? I think that's the big issue with using electronic voting machines, whether it's in a polling station, so you go into the polling station and you're using some sort of computer-based technology to vote, or doing it at home online. Are people going to trust that as much? And so I think that's what Anthony was probably talking about, in the sense of, I take a pencil and I physically write, my X on my ballot box, and I put it into a box. I see it going into a box. I know that it's going to be counted at the end of the day right there. It's not just kind of going into some random computer server. I have this theory that that act is going to make people trust the vote a lot more. And we know that at the end of the day, elections are only as good as much as they are being trusted.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the key concern. I think that, there are people who do engineering and computer science who could speak much more than I do about, the different sorts of mechanisms involved and how we can protect them from being hacked or whatever. But that issue of public trust, I think, is one of the key ones when it comes to the adoption of technology into our electoral system.
Absolutely. I think that the word trust is a lot of what we're talking about, because that's what makes an election kind of like money. Money doesn't exist without trust that it exists. An election doesn't have any value unless we trust that it has authority and power and relevance to us. I think that I wonder if this is generational. I wonder if someone who's 19 today, I certainly trust to some extent putting an X on a piece of paper and sending it off. I have more faith in that than doing anything on a computer. But I know that a 19-year-old might feel exactly the opposite. Just because to them it might be, well, that's just a piece of paper in a box that can be easily manipulated. It's all being tabulated on a computer eventually anyways. I would much rather trust, say, a blockchain voting system in which I can clearly see in the ledger where a decision was made, where it led, and it cannot be corrupted, and it's visible and transparent for all to see. I could see them seeing more trust in that than in a piece of paper going into a box that someone else takes into a room somewhere. And I wonder if this issue of trust is changing as a result of technology and as a result of a newer generation coming to be.
And that's a really interesting question that actually we will probably have data to test, moving forward. So I've done some research on that, looking at online registration again, that young people overwhelmingly trust Elections Canada to provide this service online, no problems there. So that's something we could definitely test, is to see, does that extend to an online voting system or to some sort of technological voting system? You might see a generational difference. I'm not sure of any studies off the top of my head who have tested that, but that's something that could definitely be tested.
Yeah.
And I suspect your hypothesis would be confirmed.
Yeah, I wonder, and then what ramifications does that have for our trust in the system? Is it possible then, like I know there are examples of this where different people can vote in different ways. Is it possible that we can do voting in that way, that there's no wrong way in, or is that fragmenting the system way too much?
That's really interesting. And it would be a bit of a logistical challenge, but Elections Canada does a fantastic job running elections, so I'm sure they could surmount that. I'm not entirely sure. Like, my concern with that would be, again, if different people are voting in different sorts of ways, then, the issue of trust in terms of, if some people are voting in one particular mechanism, then are they going to trust it a little bit less than people who are physically going to the polling station and voting? And you can see that. I think municipal elections in Ontario are a good example, where you have people who are voting in a variety of different means. And we already have that in Canada, people who have special ballots versus advanced polling.
Right. Which used to be, only a few years ago, not allowed. You couldn't vote in advance unless you had an excuse.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's longer than a few years ago. I think it's been somewhere around 2000 or 2004 or something like that.
Right.
And advanced voting is another thing that would be worth maybe talking about, is because I think one of the things that we often think about when we talk about, reforming the electoral system or making these sorts of changes, whether that be technology or, how you can vote, is also to take a clear look at kind of the differential effects. So essentially, are there certain population groups that this is going to help, are there certain population groups that this is actually going to hinder? Because one thing we've noticed with early voting is that the types of people going to early voting tend to be older, but then they also tend to look not that much different from the people who are voting anyway. So is this a good use of resources in order to try to attract people who wouldn't normally be voting. Because I think one of the key issues, I think, with elections in any country, and including in Canada, is that the types of people who are voting are not the same as the types of people who aren't voting.
Right.
And that causes a key issue. Maybe that's a big can of worms to open. But so when we think about electoral reforms, whether that be online voting, electronic voting, early voting, we need to think about which population groups are most likely to access this and how this might affect turnout among those. Now, obviously, there are some population groups for which early voting is, fantastic. I don't have data to test it, but I would assume that, for example, voters with a disability might find that that's much more accessible because they have more options of days that they can go into the ballot box with the assistance of someone. So obviously, I'm not saying, completely scrap those different options, but it is worth having that question of who are these options assisting and what kind of changes we can make to how we technically do this voting experience in order to make it especially more accessible to those population groups that are not currently voting.
Well, and it also begs the question of what this is that we're doing when we vote, too. and the reason I bring that up is because in India, for example, you don't all vote on one day. Mm-hmm. Because it's the largest democracy in the world. It's such a massive operation. Yeah. You have to devote a lot of resources to it.
Absolutely.
And it begs the question of, well, if we have early voting and advanced voting, why do we just have one election day? Why don't we have a period of 21 days, or for example, in which we can vote, or you vote, this region votes at this time or whatever. Now, I know that there are obvious complications with that. It changes the way it kind of, flips around what a campaign is all about. But at the same time, we have to ask the question, why not? Is that, this is a difficult thing to say, but is that more democratic when you do so? Does it allow more people to participate? We're not just talking about the mechanics of it anymore. We're talking about a paradigm shift of understanding what this election process is and how that feeds into our democracy.
There's two things I would say about that. The first is that really now you can vote any day during the campaign, right? You can go into a returning office and vote. And there's lots of countries, Finland's a great example of a country that has over a week, or maybe, I don't know exactly the amount of days, but like a week of advance voting type thing. And so I think that's one thing that we need to kind of consider in the Canadian context is that you can actually vote at any point during the campaign. Now, the interesting thing that you brought up there is essentially this question of, if you're all voting at different times, are we collectively making a decision anymore?
Right, and especially in a time of where things change so quickly.
Exactly. Yeah. And so some research has demonstrated that voters who do vote early have a little less satisfaction with their vote choice once they kind of see, oh, geez, I missed out on this giant thing that happened between when I cast my ballot and election day. But I'd be curious to know, or I suppose it's the question of that trade-off between the opportunity to vote on a variety of different days and this, collective experience that we all have together on one particular day. Because one of the things that is possible, and some research has been done on early voting, is that it might actually diminish the civic significance of election day. Like, oh, I can vote any day, whatever, I'll vote eventually, and then, oh, crap, I didn't vote. And so, that there is this idea of we have this communal act that we do once every 4 years. So does having those other opportunities diminish it? Does it turn into something like I think in the municipal election, I voted in my pajamas at home. Is there something to be said about physically going to a polling station, seeing your neighbors? I don't know if people do that anymore. I'll find out this time because I'm kind of in a neighborhood where I might see my neighbors at the polling station. Is there something about that? One of the greatest examples, or something I would love to test, like if I could just test things, do an experiment. In Australia, oftentimes elections, schools where they have their polling stations, some of the schools will have their school fete that day, and they will have a sausage sizzle, and they'll be selling sausages, and so it's become kind of a thing in Australia. Is you go and vote and you get your sausage, right? Obviously there's compulsory voting there, but just finding this sense of community focus in the voting experience, I think, is something really interesting that I would love to be able to test. But of course, it's hard to manipulate in experimental means. But you can see it in other cases, like in Australia. I wish we had an equivalent of the your voting sausage type thing. Yeah.
But what a fascinating idea that this is a civic experience.
Yeah.
That this day when we all share this in common, and I think that I don't know if we're missing that, but I think that there's a lot of argument about, say, being able to vote from your computer is eroding that sense. And therefore, can we draw a line and say that if we erode that, we're eroding the trust in the system? That if we don't have this community experience, this almost cathartic experience of voting, because even if the result isn't what we like, we still participated, we still had it out, we still went to the dance, if you were.
Yeah.
Is there an erosion there of trust that we're seeing as a result of this kind of dissembling of this community experience?
Yeah, it's hard to know cause and effect there, right? Because is it the fact that something has been changing in society and that is leading to lower voting, or people aren't having these sorts of experiences and therefore not trusting society? So,
well, could we then ask the bigger question, is trust eroding in elections and democracy?
Oh, wow. Okay. There's a lot of things I could say about that. So there is some sense, I don't know if you've read Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Yeah. Anyway, but this idea that social capital or exactly the kind of trust that we have in each other in society has been eroding in American democracy, though I think it could be applied to most Western democracies. And that would certainly say that, lower voter turnout is just a symptom of this larger issue.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering, is trust in our democracy and in elections eroding? Do we see evidence that people are just losing faith in it?
Yeah, so actually I presented a paper at the American Political Science Association in August that was looking actually at satisfaction with democracy over time. Because the brilliant thing is that scholars have been doing public opinion surveys across the world over numbers of years. So now we have this beautiful data sets that we can use to take a look at that. And so what my co-author and I, Patricia Mockler and I, found was that there was some slight decreases in satisfaction with democracy, but we're largely responding to actual changes in democratic quality. So I think the question is, have there been changes in the quality of our democracy that have therefore resulted in things like lower voter turnout?
So, sorry, what is quality of our democracy? I know this is something you research, this word quality, but what does that mean for the layperson? What does it mean when we talk about the quality of our democracy or the quality of an election?
Quality of an election. Yeah. So there's a variety of different ways. I look specifically at how we measure the quality of an election. So I'll stick with that maybe for this conversation.
Sure.
But there's a variety of different ways you can do that, right? So there's an approach where you can kind of ask people how they feel about their elections because, they're the ones who need to trust it. They're the ones who need to respond to it. So we call that more of a sociological approach. There's a legal approach where you can kind of measure the quality of an election based on did it actually conform to the laws that we set out ahead of time. Now, the problem, of course, with that being you can have really unfair laws and you could have an election, in a country where only one party is allowed to run, totally fulfills the laws,
Sure.
But we know that, or we would argue that the laws are unjust. And so I tend to take an approach that's been really popularized by Pippa Norris at Harvard University and the University of Sydney, this electoral integrity approach that it's more normative. So we have international norms and standards that we have decided this is how we will measure the quality of an election. Here are the things that we need to have. We need to have the ability for everyone to have an equal voice. We want to have the ability for a variety of different people, be that men, women, different ethnicities, to be able to run for politics. We want to make sure that the equality of voice isn't influenced by money in politics. So all of these sorts of things that we would list it out in a variety of different international agreements.
And you can apply those norms regardless of cultural context
Exactly.
or political type, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Now, the tricky thing then is for scholars is, well, then how do you measure that? How well a country is or a country's elections are actually fulfilling those norms and standards. And that's very much up for debate. There's a variety of different methods that we use, but that's where a lot of my research kind of starts off, is saying, okay, we have these norms and standards. So a project I'm working on right now looks at campaign finance. And so essentially one of the questions that this project that Pippa Norris started, the Electoral Integrity Project, one of the questions they ask is, do rich people buy elections? And I said, I wonder what that looks like in the Canadian context. I wonder, we have these campaign finance regulations that cap donations, that, only individuals are allowed to donate. Has that influenced or has that kind of mitigated the challenges with we don't want rich people to buy elections? And so that's kind of research that's ongoing right now for me, is trying to apply that norm and standard into the Canadian context.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because rich people, quote unquote, could buy elections, regardless of if the fact the laws are completely fair, we could call them completely fair, and even if the people feel like their vote is being heard, they can still be manipulated prior to election day by campaign finance, for example. I mean, this is a huge conversation in the United States, obviously, where they don't have the same laws and restrictions that we have in Canada, where a billionaire can essentially bankroll an entire campaign and buy an immense amount of advertising online, on TV, on the radio, and before you know it, they've just bought, this is quote unquote, but millions and millions of votes. Now, those people all still made their decision. They did so legally. So we're confronted with this really interesting dilemma, I think, that many people take different sides on. But it's pretty hard to argue with the fact that it does have an effect. That spending money in an election has a huge effect. I mean, it's almost obvious. I mean, we know that if Nike buys a lot of advertising time, they're going to sell more shoes. If a political candidate gets more ad space, they're going to get more votes.
I don't know for sure about that, though. I think there's some older research, older as in early 2000s research, that demonstrates some impact of the amount of donations you get on your vote share. But one of the things I'm doing with this project, and I don't have results for that yet, is to retest that in the new climate of what sort of regulations we have for campaign finance. Is essentially, if you get more money, are you more likely to win? Or is it more of a case that what's going on in the national campaign that, you as a local candidate have very little sway over is really what's going to end up influencing how people vote?
Right.
So you kind of have to almost get into the minds of a voter. When you go to vote, are you thinking about the local candidate or are you thinking about the national party? That's a whole other issue there. But the thing is, in Canada, we vote for local candidates, right?
Yeah.
That's how we vote. So how much of an impact money has there I find that fascinating.
Well, it's an interesting thing that's happening in the United States, and I think it's also happening in Canada, which is the nationalization of politics, right? A lot has been written about how in the United States, just a few decades ago, people were much more concerned with local issues and much more aware of local candidates, and the national game was further away and didn't feel so impactful on day-to-day life and wasn't a big of a deal as it is today. And now everything filters down from the center. Everything filters down from this national scale. And, going back to this idea of money, is money having less impact than I'm suggesting it does? Or are you saying it has almost no impact compared to the other things that are in place?
I don't think we have an answer to that question yet, to be quite honest. It's something that I'm really curious to test, like in the local race aspect, whether and that's something that political scientists are debating, is how much does the local race matter as opposed to the national campaign?
Yeah.
And so there's many studies that have well, not many, but there are some studies who have taken a look at that and have found some modest impact on the quality of the candidate at the local level, and looking at, especially in kind of swing ridings where those local candidates can have a bit more of an impact. But that's something we're continuing to debate, and kind of contemporary, today we would probably say, a lot of people I think would probably say, no, what matters is the party leader. What matters is, the national campaign. But I'm curious to test that further, and I don't have an answer to that quite yet.
One really interesting part of this conversation so far that I wanted to pick out was this question of the civic significance of Election Day, the communal experience of Election Day. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about privacy and how the act of voting is a private and a very sacred act, but it's also a communal one, and how do we bring these two things together? Another interesting question that we ask coming up in this conversation is, what if Canada asked for electoral assistance? What if other countries sent us observers? What would they see? What would they tell us to do better? All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Yeah, and I wondered to what extent social media and the internet factor into this. I mean, that seems to be one force that would nationalize a political campaign, right? Because if I'm living in Vancouver, for example, I'm going to be less concerned about what's happening in Halifax if I don't read about it every day. And I'm not going to read about it in my local paper, but if I'm on Facebook and I have friends in Halifax, it's going to be much more in my news feed than it would before.
Oh, this brings up a really interesting point, is with social media, we would actually say or I would actually say that perhaps you're actually getting less of a national campaign in the sense that different groups, probably maybe regional, maybe not regional, are getting very different news, very different advertisements because of micro-targeting than everybody. So we would say back in the day when everybody sat down to watch their national news at night, we all have the same type of information to make our decision. We're all seeing the same sorts of ads, and there was always some sort of differences, in French language versus English language, but we generally would see the same sorts of things, right? But today, you individually are going to be seeing very different ads than I do.
Well, yeah.
Just based on sociodemographics, based on where you're living, based on certain groups that you're part of.
Well, and how I've curated my online experience.
Exactly.
I mean, where do I go when I open my internet browser? I mean, for me, it might be the New York Times and the Guardian and, I don't know, 538 if I'm following election stuff in the United States. But for someone else, it might be directly to Fox News every time.
And even also what kind of advertisements you're seeing. So, if you buy an ad on Facebook, you can say, I really want it to be seen by, 18 to 25-year-olds, white women who live in, Eastern Ontario. And so that I find really fascinating, the fact that we're all getting different types of advertising, different types of messages.
Yeah.
And that might erode the ability of us to make a national, or not even a national, just a collective Canadian decision. And also, there's some suggestions that will also lead to polarization in the sense that you'll be fed the sort of messages that are going to reinforce what you already believe, and you're going to end up with such distinct groups who are not really talking to each other anymore and really not seeing the same sorts of things anymore.
It's really fascinating. We seem to be having these twin opposing forces of nationalization but also fragmentation happening at the same time, and the erosion of, say, the local paper. Right? In Canada now, there is no such thing as the local paper. They're all owned by one conglomerate, Post Media, right? And it's difficult to see how a local conversation can happen in the way that it did 30, 40, 50 years ago. But I want to go to this word that you just mentioned, polarization. And I wonder, I'm talking to a political scientist and talking about trust. Is this increasing polarization? I mean, first of all, is it happening as we think it's happening in the big conversation? But is it having an impact on trust and the quality of our elections?
Oh, wow. That's a huge question. So there are some theories that, I'm going to kind of draw maybe from more of the research done in the American context, because I don't know how, I'm sure there's great research being done in Canada as well on this. The idea that, you end up in your own echo chamber, essentially. You end up reading the sorts of news, seeing the sorts of comments that you're used to seeing that reinforce your beliefs, and then that kind of draws you towards the extremes of the ideological spectrum. And so that's something, especially when you look at the types of people who tend to be commenting on message boards, tend to be donating, who tend to be volunteering for campaigns. There's this theory that they might be already the more ideologically extreme, and that will essentially pull people away from the center, pull people away from talking to each other. Whether that has happened in the same sort of way in Canada, I don't know that off the top of my head. I'd have to do some digging to see if any research had been done on that. But my thought on that is one of the things that does actually help, though, is the fact that we do have a multi-party system. So everybody's, it's not like you're just trying to capture the left vote share or the right vote shares. You do have to take into consideration as a party who your next closest, opponents are. And so then the other thing about you'd mentioned is this link then between polarization and trust. Yeah. And I find it very problematic when you start to see your political opponent as the other, as someone so far away from you that there could be never any sort of opportunity to work together. Has politics always been like that? Maybe. I don't know if that's a unique thing now. But I could also see how the new media environment would kind of entrench that. And so, I think there's definitely lots of room for scholars to be looking into this, for people like you to be having this conversation and discussing that.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because if I think of the ideal of our democracy, which is similar to the ideal of American democracy, it is that it's a game. And that if you win and I lose, I accept that you've won. But you must respect my rights once you've won, and vice versa. And therefore, it's like a game. And so we have to abide by the rules of the game. You're making a face like you don't like the description of a game. What do you think?
Oh, no. It's just more of the sense like, this is very serious stuff. And I guess just the connotation of a game just makes it seem like.
Yeah. So I had a conversation.
I know what you mean, but that's the facial expression.
But it's interesting because when we talk about games, I had a conversation with one of the founders of the world of gamification, David Chandras, who works at Ryerson University in Toronto. And I think it was like episode 74 or something. And he talked about serious gaming. Yeah. He's very much like, approaching the game as something that is fundamental to what it means to be human, as opposed to something you do in your spare time.
Yeah, of course.
And so when we talk about elections in that way, I didn't mean like we're playing a little game that makes no difference. Although some people think of politics that way.
Exactly, and that's why I wasn't sure what you were getting at.
It's just this throwaway, like, stupid game so that you leave the rich people to run things, and you fools can play your game, right? But what I actually mean is that it's a game in the sense that there are rules, there are sides, but there are also expectations. And I am treated in the same way that you'll be treated. And if our side wins, then you have to respect our victory. But at the same time, you can't just kill us all if you win, right? I mean, that's the rule of the majority is tempered, back to John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, tempered by this, the rights of the minority. But that's like a game. There are rules to it. And trust and the quality of an election, I think, fits into that. I only trust that this game of basketball is working because they're playing fairly and there are referees. If they're just doing whatever they want and one side's beating the other team up and not letting them even touch the ball, that's not fair, and I have no trust in it anymore, and I don't want to watch.
Exactly.
And I think that democracy would fit into the same category.
Okay, yeah. And essentially, elections are so fragile in the sense that, one thing can happen that can completely erode trust in an electoral system. All it takes is kind of one big thing. And so it's definitely something that we need to think about and just be cognizant of the fact that elections are something very precious, something very delicate that we need to make sure that are being run and that we're thinking about how we can run them better.
Do you think that that's happening where, like you said a moment ago, that the other side seems so far away, so much the other, that we can't stomach their victory? And is that eroding the quality and trust in elections?
One thing I would just hesitate is I don't know if it's always been that way or if that's a unique phenomenon now. So that's one thing that I just want to kind of temper that discussion with is it's possible that that's always been that the political opponent has always been seen as the other, and
we've always hated each other.
Well, and even the fact that our parliament is set up in an adversarial manner, right? Yeah. You have the government and the opposition, and in some ways that's really helpful to make government work, to hold government to account. There's a reason it was set up that way. I think it gets problematic when it starts to people just start turning off entirely from politics because all they see is discussions of the big sensational things that we know can attract viewers, that we know negative advertising works, for example. And so, it's kind of almost combating kind of our weakest motives to like, well, we want to watch this thing, we want to see the sensational stuff, but at the same time we know that it might not always be the best. Yeah,
there was an article I read, I think it was in The Economist some time ago, that was essentially saying that we think of the moment now in politics as being an aberration. We think of this current time of intense polarization and reduced trust in elections and great widespread voter apathy as an aberration. And the article said, in terms of American history, actually, the aberration is the post-war consensus between around 1945 to around September 11th, 2001, this period where, or even you could say the fall of the Soviet Union, this period where right and left seemed to get along and seemed to agree on where to take the country. Different points of view on how to do it, but for most of American history, it was not like that at all. The two sides or three or whatever hated each other, and there was this intense polarized conflict, and this is almost a return to normal.
Yeah, and think even about, today, no party leader would say, we need to get rid of socialized medicine. There's very few things. I think there's differences in how we want to go about the change. So something like how we're going to tackle climate change, but very few parties would say that climate change doesn't exist, or that it isn't something that is important to tackle, or that, pharmacare isn't a good idea. Whether we have the money to do it or not is another question. And so I think, especially in Canadian politics, I think we agree on a lot more than we disagree on.
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of how we're going to do it, and who's going to be doing it.
Do you think that elections are more emotional now than they were?
Oh, I expect people have been emotional about elections since 1867 and beyond before that, right? I don't think that's something new. I would actually say that it's possible that people are less tied to one party now. So there's some research that people aren't joining political parties in the same sorts of ways that they used to. People don't have like one specific ideology that they, stick with type thing. Well, maybe they do, but like, it's not the sense of like, I am a conservative, I will always be a conservative type thing. So, obviously there are tons of factors that go into someone's vote choice and partisan preferences, but, it might even be the opposite in the sense that, it might be that people are more detached now than they were previously.
Yeah, and I guess when I ask about this emotion, it seems that that's the quality that we see on social media, in a tweet, in a newscast. But that's a very small fraction of the conversation.
Exactly. And that's, the people who are talking about politics, so emotionally on Twitter are in the minority, right? That's not necessarily a good, cross-section of Canada, right? And also even, I say this oftentimes with my students when we talk about surveys, even the people who are going to respond to a political survey or a polling and are not necessarily the same types of people who at the end of the day are going to go out and vote or are representative of the population, which is why I guess that gets into a whole different can of worms, the polling issue.
Yeah.
But I think, those people who are making a lot of news or a lot of noise on social media are not necessarily representative of ordinary Canadians. And I say that with air quotes.
Right, but they can still have an impact, much like money
Absolutely,
can.
yeah.
One thing that's interesting about your work is that you deal a lot in electoral cycles, and that you're dealing a lot with, comparing other countries to our own or with each other. And many countries require assistance for their democracy, right? Many countries ask, can you please send observers? Can you please send constitutional lawyers to allow us to run our elections better? And Canada has been a country to send observers and lawyers all around the world for many, many years. It's an interesting question if you were to flip it around and say, do we need assistance? And I'm not saying, we could have the hypothetical question, if we were in the position to ask for assistance to run our election, what specifically would we ask for? I don't know if that's a fair question, but
I'm not sure,
because I don't know who we would be asking to do that. Who could be more of, I don't know, but it's an interesting way to reframe the conversation because, it's obvious when we say, okay, we're going to think about elections in Ukraine and how they're run there. And there's all kinds of problems, and there's been problems for 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union and blah, blah, blah. But surely we're not perfect.
Yeah,
and if we were to reframe it and ask, come help us with our election, what would we be asking for?
Oh, that's
Or what would other people tell us?
Ooh, that's really interesting. So one thing I kind of want to start off with, and please gear me back on track if I lose.
Tangents are good.
Okay. One thing that I want to highlight though is, within the international realm, Canada is very well respected in terms of the quality of our elections, and then also the quality of Elections Canada. So one of the areas of my research is looking at election management.
And
so
the institutions.
Exactly. So the bodies that are actually running elections, the people who are printing ballots and registering voters, and, in some cases, not in Canada, but are delineating boundaries, are doing all of these kind of nuts and bolts of running elections. And Canada was actually, one of the earlier adopters of an independent election management body, and it's very well respected around the world. So in that area, I think, our elections are one that people look up to, that we are in a position to assist in terms, because I think one of the biggest things when it comes to international assistance is very much building the capacity of these bodies to run elections. So, and then the observation thing, the other thing I want to mention is, I think it's useful in some scenarios, but increasingly not useful because, as I said earlier, we know that elections are not just election day. So unless you're going to have really long-term observers in there, and that the country is going to provide access for those long-term observers, election observation I think is useful in some specific cases, but I don't think is kind of the panacea when it comes to assistance.
But we could expand the role of the observer then, as you just said.
Yeah, so I think rather than observation, kind of looking more at how do we provide capacity building for the local election management body. I think that's the key thing. Now, the answer to that question, how do we provide capacity building, is one that scholars are working on actively. And, we know that more long-term investment as opposed to kind of short-term, we'll send you a bunch of voting machines. We know that that's more what's going to assist. But that's obviously kind of a messy situations where it's hard to kind of think of one specific thing that we could do to fix it. Anyway, but I'll get back to your actual question, which was, what is one area, I think, to rephrase it, maybe one area where Canada still has challenges. And I want to preface this by saying that I don't think our challenges are unique to us, that they're very similar challenges to what the United States is facing, what other Western democracies are facing. So I don't think it's a uniquely Canadian problem, but the things that I would pay attention to is, first of all, the inequality in participation and the fact that there are certain population groups that are not voting, that are not donating, that are not participating in a variety of different ways that you could classify participation in the same way that other people are. So are we hearing certain voices, older people, middle-aged people, people who are in a stable residential address, people who, are more active and more educated, and we're only hearing from a certain segment of the population in terms of the voting process and then in other forms of participation. So that inequality still concerns me. The second thing is this challenge, of course, of misinformation. I think we're getting into the point where we're starting to try to ask those questions of how do we even prep society? How do we build societal resiliency to be able to kind of digest news and digest information, especially about the electoral system and the electoral process, in a way that makes us kind of think twice about what we're seeing. And I don't think we have a really good solution to that yet. I think we say things like democratic resiliency. We say things like, we need better civic education, or we need more educational tools, media literacy. And we're just starting as academics to do the sorts of studies that are going to provide the answers to those questions. So it's a really exciting time, I think, to be an academic, because we're asking some of those fundamental questions of, okay, we see this to be a problem, dis and misinformation, the fact that, people are potentially going to be exposed to things that are not entirely true, or that have a grain of truth in them, but then, don't know how to interpret where it's coming from, or what date it's coming from, or what kind of messaging it is. And we don't know yet how to best kind of inoculate our population against that challenge. There are tools out there, there are games, there are, information, I think of like CBC's chatbot, or there's games that you can do, but we don't really know the effectiveness yet. Yeah. And it makes an exciting time to be a scholar, but also kind of scary because we don't know what the solution to that is yet.
Well, I'm really interested in the language that you're using there, inoculation and also resilience, right?
Yeah.
I mean, resilience in the sense that, can I withstand the shocks that will come in the news, or the shocks of the outcome of a particular election, understanding that the system itself is still paramount to any of these shocks that I experience, and can I withstand it without being completely knocked over? Yeah.
Right. So when I talk about cybersecurity, I often talk about that issue of resiliency. I am not a computer scientist or an engineer. I can't predict what the next tool is going to be to hack websites or hack voting or whatever sorts of things. I don't deal with the technical side. What I deal with is how humans interact with that technology. And so how can we prepare Canadians or any individuals to kind of think through the right things when they're interacting with that technology, or how to react to when something happens, or when they see something on the news, and trying to figure out how the human beings, or the human aspect of how we interact with our technology. I think that's really, really fascinating, and something that deserves a lot more study and research, how you build that resiliency, essentially that question.
Yeah, and also this question of this connection between trust and technology.
It always comes back to public trust.
Yeah. It's such a fundamental factor here.
Yeah.
Holly, I want to get to the 10 things at the end.
Oh, dear.
You can react to these in any way you like, but just remember brevity is a gift. All right, the first one is, these are simple, but they're also really complex. The first one is democracy. Go.
It's very precious. I think it's something we can't take for granted.
Okay. Why? But why?
Well, you go back to the Churchill thing that democracy is, the best system. And, until we find another alternative, I think that our democracy has provided for a lot of opportunities for people to,
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with you.
I just realized I'm like, okay, now I need to explain why democracy is good. Okay.
Yeah. And it's funny because I don't think we answer that question enough. Why is democracy valuable? Mm-hmm. And there's a corollary to that too, which has come up on this podcast a few times, which is this democracy? Right? A lot of people have argued that this is not actually democracy. This is an electoral dictatorship, sense. Right?
Oh.
I don't mean to say that like Athenian direct democracy is what we should be practicing. Yeah. Although in Estonia, they're showing that that's maybe actually feasible to vote and participate in the democracy every single day through technology. But
the tricky thing is, though, it's hard to expect an ordinary citizen who is not spending all of their time thinking about politics to see the big picture all the time, right? Yeah. That we ask our representatives to weigh the pros and cons, to have to think about these sorts of things, because we can't do that all the time. And sometimes our visceral reactions might not be always the right reaction, right? So, there's a place for referendums, there's a place for plebiscites, but, I don't think having them every day is a great idea. You're going to get a certain segment of the population participating who really care about that particular issue.
I think it would just be exhausting.
Yeah. I need somebody to kind of take up some of that mental space. Yeah. Too. Yeah.
The French philosopher Michel Foucault said that one of the state's powers is to exhaust you into subservience, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, just the idea that the state has the power to just exhaust you with paperwork and bureaucracy, and still you can't fight back, right? That old, resistance idea. But that, to have a plebiscite every day would just be like, hey, I give up. I don't care anymore. Do what you want.
That's what we have now, is essentially, okay, I'm going to entrust this process to people that I trust. Again, getting back to that public trust issue, instead of me dealing with it every single day.
Yeah.
So there's value in that.
Have you heard of this book called Radical Markets?
No.
It's a really interesting idea in the book. I haven't actually read it, but I've read about it. And one of the ideas is that let's say you get 100 credits to vote with during election time.
Oh, okay.
Okay. But you can spend them in any way you like. And if you have 100 things you want to vote on, you can spend your 100 credits in those different things. But if you spend one vote or two votes on the same thing, your votes are worth less.
Interesting.
Right? So the more concentrated you are on one specific issue, the more diluted your power is. But if everyone concentrates their vote on that one issue, they'll win. But if you are willing and able to see the bigger picture and think about more things, your vote will have greater power, but dispersed over more things. So it's taking what reason it's called radical markets is it's taking market-based ideas and seeing if they can be applied in radical ways to our democracy.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a good idea. I don't think they're actually proposing it as necessarily what we should do. They're just saying, think about this. How does this make us think now about our democracy? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Okay, next one.
Oh, dear.
We've spent a lot of time on democracy, which I think is okay.
Kind of fundamental.
Next one is related, obviously. It's elections.
All right, so elections need to be protected. There's lots of vulnerabilities, and I think it can take just one thing going wrong to erode public trust in elections. And so I think it's really important that we focus on issues of electoral management, that we focus on issues of electoral integrity, that even if in Canada we seem to have pretty darn good elections that are well run, it's not something that we should just kind of rest on our laurels.
Yeah. Next one is the military.
Oh, great people to work with. Yeah. I love it. Yeah, I love working for the military. I'm very much a civilian, but I absolutely love working for the military. Yeah.
Cool. Learning.
Needs to be active. I'm a huge, huge proponent of active learning.
What do you mean by that?
So this idea that you don't necessarily learn by sitting and listening to me talk me giving a lecture, as we would typically see in a university setting. So instead I use a lot of activity-based learning. So, let's try this out. Let's work on a worksheet or think critically about something, or, act something out, and try it out and be active, because that's how students, I think, are going to learn the best.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Diversity
is great.
Okay. Well, then why?
So I think it's important to have a variety of different viewpoints in terms of in our politics, in terms of the population that I see among my students, and I think you just are so enriched by having a more diversity of viewpoints, and I think it's always important to get challenged. Sometimes I'll play devil's advocate with my students, because it's good to get challenged. And I think going back to our conversation about political discourse, I think that's important, that you get challenged and you think through things. Obviously, we need to be polite and we need to be respectful of each other, but the more viewpoints, the better.
Yeah, and especially ones that I haven't encountered before. That might make me a better, richer person.
Yeah, I'm the first person who will say, I still have so much more to learn. I have a PhD, but there's so much more to learn, and I learn that from the people who are around me who have different viewpoints and different experiences. Even just, giving the small example of since I've arrived at a military college, things that I know now about foreign policy or about the military that I never would have known if I hadn't actually gotten to know these people.
Yeah.
And so I think that's always worthwhile.
Yeah, the other side of the coin of learning is adventure, really, like going on a journey. Privacy
is important. And I think there are new challenges to privacy when it comes to elections. I know I keep referring everything back to my research, but that's kind of the area I feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
Especially kind of one thing we didn't talk about that I think might be worthwhile to kind of think about is the fact that political parties collect a lot of data, but are run by kind of precarious and sometimes volunteer organizations and apparatuses.
Yeah.
And that's one area of privacy that I think we might want to pay more attention to.
Yeah, there's also, I think you're completely right. There's also this, connection between privacy and the act of voting. Voting is a very private.
Why didn't I think of that one? Yeah.
Well, no, because I think actually your example is much more top of mind and much more relevant to what's happening in the world today. If I were to ask what on earth is going on, I think people would say data and privacy is huge. But I just think there's this fundamental connection here between what I do in the ballot box and that private activity that is in a way sacrosanct. And I wonder if the sanctity of voting is based in part on the fact that it is private.
Mm-hmm. And also the fact that when we talked earlier about using technology in voting, how that might erode privacy. If I'm voting at home in my pajamas, who says someone else isn't there manipulating me? Who says that someone else is not, taking that? Obviously, it would be against the law to do that, but isn't taking, my passcode or whatever and voting for me or watching me as I vote. And that's another key issue with electronic voting.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, last one.
Oh, dear.
Trust.
We haven't talked enough about that.
No, but we got to sum it up now.
Oh, geez. Okay. So, I think our elections and our democratic system relies entirely and heavily on trust. If we do not trust the system, we are not going to respect it, and that will erode our democracy. And that's what I do. That's why I study elections, electoral integrity, is because it could all fall apart if we don't trust the system. And how do we make sure that we do trust the system, that different population groups that aren't typically represented also feel like they can trust the system? And that's, I think, an area that I'll have the rest of my career to do research on.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating about that is the follow-up question, which is, well, what is trust? What does it mean to trust in this? And don't worry. I'm not gonna ask you that question because we're at the end now.
Define trust.
But honestly, it has to be defined because there are many outcomes to that question. It could be, well, I trust that the system will work to my benefit. That's one. But there's also, I trust that the system is fair. Doesn't mean it's working to my benefit.
No, exactly.
Just that it's fair. Those are different things. And then there's many other answers too. Well, when we talk about trust, there may be conflicting views of this. And therefore, my view of how politics should work could be very different from someone else's. And if my view wins, then they have no trust in it anymore, and vice versa. And it's just a very interesting dilemma.
Yeah, we reached kind of this democratic consensus of how we think elections should be run, what kind of norms we want, what democracy should look like, and if and when that changes, then we'll have to do some real soul searching.
Do you think it's still a consensus?
Oh dear.
Sorry, that's my last question.
Okay. So I think for the vast majority of Canadians, yes. I don't think there's much of a question. That being said, that there is, and you can see this in the rise of populism, there are people who are disgruntled by the system. Now, whether they would say all together that they want the system to change, or if maybe they just want the types of people who are in power to change, and that requires some change in the system for that to happen. I think support for democracy would be very, and I could go and look this up, but I think support for democracy would be very high in Canada, and support for high quality elections. I don't think that's, I'm notorious for being not at all an alarmist, but maybe it's a little naive of me to say so, but I do believe that Canadians do trust the electoral system, and that is the best option.
Yeah, no, it certainly feels that way. Holly, thank you so much for a fascinating and enlightening conversation.
Thanks. It's been great to chat with you.
To learn more about Holly Ann Garnett, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me to let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and to give me your suggestions for future episodes, whether that's a guest you'd like to have on the show or a topic that you'd like to have discussed. Now, your quote of the week is from John Kenneth Galbraith from his book, The Age of Uncertainty. When people put their ballots in the boxes, they are, by that act, inoculated against the feeling that the government is not theirs. They then accept in some measure that its errors are their errors, its aberrations their aberrations, that any revolt will be against them. It's a remarkably shrewd and rather conservative arrangement when one thinks of it. Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for the music, and special thanks for this episode to the Royal Military College of Canada for giving us a space in which to record. Next week, we're talking with University of Alberta professor Fiona Nicol about gambling. I'll see you then.